God told David through Nathan that the consequences of David's sin of taking Bathsheba and killing Uriah would be out in the open for everyone to see. These consequences began with the rape of his daughter Tamar by his son Amnon. Then Tamar's brother Absalom killed Amnon in vengeance. These were the opening salvos of the consequences that spread to involve the entire nation of Israel. David faced betrayal by his son Absalom and by trusted friends. He experienced the violation of the concubines who were under his protection. He faced exile from Jerusalem, the city he had established as the capital of Israel, and the possibility of God removing his favor from him. In the midst of this, David also experienced loyalty and faithfulness from those who were unwavering in their love and support. Many of David's psalms are thought to have been written during this time of exile. In particular, Psalm 3 and number 61 were written as David fled from Absalom. When we read these psalms and others written by David, we see the anguish of his soul and the unwavering faith he had in God's justice and mercy. I'm Dan Cathcart, and this is the Promise of Rest. While Absalom was in Hebron, the number of his supporters grew. One of the men who was with Absalom grew alarmed about Absalom's growing army and brought word to David. 2 Samuel 15:13-14. Now a messenger came to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." So David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." The message about Absalom's rebellion seemed to take David completely by surprise. He was unprepared to counter Absalom's growing army. David didn't have a large armed force in the city. In addition, Jerusalem was the center of Absalom's scheme to steal the hearts of the people, so the residents of Jerusalem could not be counted on to back David. Now, since David refused to allow Jerusalem to be the center of the battle between himself and Absalom, he fled the city. David's entire household, except for 10 concubines he left behind to watch over his house, went with David, traveling on foot. The first stop on their way out of the city was at a house on the outskirts. David stopped to organize his followers and to see who had accompanied him. 2 Samuel 15, verse 18. Then all his servants passed before him, and all the Cherethites, all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. Among those with him were the 600 men. We first see 600 men when David rescues Keilah from the Philistines in 1 Samuel 23:13. The 600 men were with him when he was in hiding from Saul in the Judean wilderness. They continued with him when he took refuge in Gath and went up with him to Hebron after the death of Saul. The Septuagint reads the Hebrew words Gittites as Gibborim, that is, the mighty men of David, of whom 37 are listed in 2 Samuel 23. The pulpit commentary explains. The Septuagint reads Gibborim, and without doubt these are the persons meant. But while they were styled Gibborim, the mighties, for honor's sake, because of their prowess, they probably were popularly called David's Gittites, because they were 600 men who had formed his little army when he sought refuge with Achish, king of Gath. Now these men had faithfully supported David throughout his exile and became his closest guards during his reign. As members of the 600 died and retired, other men seem to have been appointed to replace them. Among the new recruits was a man named Ittai. 2 Samuel 15:19-21. Then the king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today, since I go I know not where? Return and take your brethren back. Mercy and truth will be with you." And Ittai answered the king and said, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be." Now Ittai was a foreigner, probably a Philistine officer. He was well qualified to be one of the 600. David would later place him in charge of a third of his army. Ittai refused to return back from following David. He reminds us of the foreigner Ruth, who refused to turn back from following Naomi. Ittai chose to cleave to David just as Ruth chose to cleave to Naomi. From the outskirts of the city, David and his group will officially depart from the city. Now, in order to do so, they needed to cross the brook Kidron. Here, the scripture uses the word abar, number 5674 in Strong's Concordance, meaning to cross over. Abar is used 6 times in reference to crossing over the brook. The imagery of that crossing is very much like the imagery of the children of Israel crossing the Jordan River to enter the Promised Land. Both crossings include the presence of the priests, the Levites, and the ark. 2 Samuel 15, 22 through 24. So David said to Ittai, "Go and cross over." Then Ittai the Gittite and all his men and all the little ones who were with him crossed over. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. The king himself also crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. There was Zadok also, and all the Levites with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had finished crossing over from the city. The first to cross over were the warriors, just like the first to cross over the Jordan River were the armies of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. The people crossed until finally the king crossed last. The high priest, Abiathar, watched over the whole process just like the priest oversaw Israel crossing over the Jordan River. The priest Zadok, along with the contingent of Levites, brought the ark from Jerusalem. Abiathar, the high priest, came from the tabernacle, which was located in Gibeon, to the northwest of Jerusalem. Now, after everyone had crossed over, David instructed Zadok to take the ark back to Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 15, verse 25. Then the king said to Zadok, "Carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place." David backed up his request by instructing Zadok and Abiathar to keep him informed of Absalom's plans. The NKJV Study Bible comments on David's decision to send the ark back. It was David who was going into exile, not the Lord. The symbol of God's presence with his people would remain in the place of worship for the entire community. This reminds us of Yeshua, who crossed over from Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives on the day of his ascension. As he ascended into heaven, God's presence remained with his disciples in the form of the Holy Spirit and remains with us today. As David went into exile, he submitted himself completely to God's will about his future. Now, this contrasts with Absalom's deceitful yet almost identical words in 2 Samuel 15:8 when he orchestrates his move to Hebron. At that time, Absalom stated if he returned to Jerusalem, it would be the Lord who would bring him there. When he was plotting to return to Jerusalem as king. Now, from the brook Kidron, David ascends the Mount of Olives. He went weeping and barefoot, indicating that he was in mourning. 2 Samuel 15, verse 30. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up. And he had his head covered, and went barefoot, and all the people who were with him covered their heads, and went up, weeping as they went up. Yeshua also wept over Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. David wept as he left the city, and Yeshua wept as he entered. There on the Mount of Olives, David received word that one of his closest friends and advisors, Ahithophel, conspired with Absalom to overthrow David. 2 Samuel 15, verse 31. Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba. His motive for turning against David is unclear. On one hand, he may have wanted revenge against David for taking Bathsheba in adultery. However, by supporting Absalom, he put Bathsheba's entire life and that of her sons in danger. Now his name is number 302, which means brother of folly. David prayed that Ahithophel's advice to Absalom would be foolish or folly. David also learned of the steadfast devotion of Hushai, now another close friend who joined him on the Mount of Olives. Chronicles 27:33 tells us that Ahithophel was one of David's counselors and his friend or companion. David asked Hushai to pretend to have defected to Absalom so that he could counter Ahithophel's advice as well as to keep David informed of Absalom's intentions. The prophet Ezekiel saw another departure from Jerusalem along the same route that David took. Ezekiel's chapters 10 and 11 describe God's departure from Jerusalem before the Babylonians invaded and captured the city. The glory of God departed from the temple, and then from the city, and finally from the Mount of Olives. Yeshua would also experience both betrayal and steadfast loyalty on the Mount of Olives. Judas Iscariot came to Yeshua on the mountain and betrayed him with a kiss. Peter would draw his sword to protect Yeshua from arrest by the temple guards. With Hushai's agreement to be a spy in Jerusalem, David had his informers well placed in Absalom's camp. Hushai would gather the information and pass it to Zadok and Abiathar, who would in turn pass it to David through their two sons. So, telling friends from foes in this situation was difficult. Who would be the next person to betray or abandon David? As David began to descend on the east side of the mountain, Ziba, the servant of Saul, and Mephibosheth met David with 2 donkeys and provisions for his journey. He also brought the news that Mephibosheth had betrayed David and was hoping to reclaim Saul's throne for himself. 2 Samuel 16, 3-4. Then the king said, "And where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "Indeed, he is staying in Jerusalem. For he said, 'Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me.'" So the king said to Ziba, "Here, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours." And Ziba said, "I humbly bow before you, that I may find favor in your sight, O Lord, O king." David accepted Ziba's words as truth without hearing Mephibosheth's side of the story. He rushed to judgment when Mephibosheth had the opportunity to defend himself. He stated that 2 donkeys that Ziba had with him were his donkeys, and that he needed to be able to flee Jerusalem and to join David. He said that Ziba took the donkeys to prevent him from joining David. Who is David to believe, Ziba or Mephibosheth? The Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges comments, "How could Mephibosheth, an insignificant cripple who had never claimed the crown or taken any part in politics, expect to be made king, even in the confusion of parties which might ensue upon Absalom's rebellion. Ziba's story was an audacious fiction, invented in the hope of getting a grant of the estate which he was cultivating for Mephibosheth's benefit, and in spite of its improbability, it passed muster in the haste and confusion of the moment. David's next encounter was clearly with an enemy. Shimei from the family of Saul taunted and cursed David. He threw stones at David and those with him. He accused David of killing Saul and stealing his throne. 2 Samuel 16:7 and 8. Also Shimei said thus when he cursed, come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. And the Lord had brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom unto the hand of Absalom your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man. The men who followed David, especially his nephews and generals Abishai and Joab, wanted to kill Shimei for his insults against David. But David stopped them, and stating that God had told Shimei to curse David. 2 Samuel 16:11 and 12. And David said to Abishai and all his servants, see how my son, who came from my own body, seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite? Let him alone, and let him curse, for so the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. David accepted Shimei's torment as part of his punishment for his sins. David hoped that God would see his repentant heart and restore his blessing on David in response to Shimei's cursing. Shimei paralleled David's route as David traveled to the Jordan River. He continued to shout curses, throwing stones, and kicking at the dust. Now we can describe Shimei's taunts and curses as a thorn in David's flesh. Meanwhile, Absalom and Ahithophel arrived in Jerusalem with their followers at the same time that Hushai entered the city. Hushai followed David's instructions and integrated himself with Absalom and was accepted into Absalom's inner circle. Now, however, once Absalom had taken control of Jerusalem, he didn't seem to know what he should do next. He turned to Ahithophel for advice. Ahithophel was also known for his good advice compared to the Urim and Thummim, or the oracles of God. Look at 2 Samuel 16:23. Now the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one had inquired of the oracle of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. However, in this case, Ahithophel's advice was so heinous that it would cause an irreparable breach between Absalom and David. He told Absalom to take David's concubines who had been left to keep David's house. 2 Samuel 16:20 and 21. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, give counsel as to what we should do. And Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father. Then the hands of all who are with you will be strong. Absalom followed Ahithophel's advice and set up a tent on the roof of David's house where David had first seen Bathsheba. He brought the 10 concubines into the tent where he raped them. Now everyone in Jerusalem could see the tent and would know that Absalom, or what he was doing. Now this fulfilled God's words that a friend would openly violate David's wives. It was David's friend and counselor Ahithophel who suggested that Absalom take David's concubines. With this action, Absalom was committed to not only to take the throne, but also to kill David. Absalom had possession of Jerusalem and David's house, but he didn't have possession of David. Absalom once again sought advice from Ahithophel, and this time Ahithophel advised Absalom to take 12,000 choice warriors and immediately pursue David. In doing so, he would catch David weary from the journey and unprepared to fight. It was excellent advice, and if Absalom had followed it, he would definitely have been able to kill David, who had only 600 mighty men with him. Now this is where Hushai was able to thwart Absalom's coup to overthrow David. He acknowledged that Ahithophel was known for his good advice, but suggested at this time that the advice was not so good. 2 Samuel 17, 7-9. So Hushai said to Absalom, "The advice that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time. For," said Hushai, "you know your father and his men, that they are mighty men, and that they are enraged in their minds, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. And your father is a man of war, and will not camp with the people. Surely by now he is hidden in some pit, or in some other place. And it will be, when some of them are overthrown at the first, that whoever hears it will say, 'There is a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.'" Hushai built up the reputation of David's 600 and David's ability to, as a wise general, to instill fear in Absalom and his men. He stated that they would suffer early casualties, which would in turn cause the people to doubt Absalom's ability to defeat David. Hushai advised Absalom to wait and gather a large force against David before attacking in force. Further, he told Absalom that Absalom needed to be the one leading the army. Hushai then sent word to David through Zadok and Abiathar and their sons about the advice that he and Ahithophel gave to Absalom. He urged David to quickly cross the Jordan to safety. Absalom decided to follow Hushai's advice, which greatly angered Ahithophel. Ahithophel went to his home and killed himself. 2 Samuel 17, verse 23. Now when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey and arose and went home to his house, to his city. Then he put his household in order and hanged himself and died, and he was buried in his father's tomb. Now this reminds us of Judas Iscariot, Yeshua's friend and one of Yeshua's inner circle who betrayed Yeshua and then killed himself afterwards. David safely crossed over the Jordan River and set up his camp at Mahanaim, the same place where Ishbosheth had his capital when he reigned as king over Israel. Now help poured into David's camp, including help from an unexpected source. 2 Samuel 17:27 tells us that Shobi, the son of the Ammonite king Nahash, who humiliated David's ambassadors, sent help. Now this sets up a scenario similar to when David and Ishbosheth vied for the kingship of Israel. The question then and now was who held the hearts of the people. David experienced both betrayal and fierce loyalty. He acknowledged that God was disciplining him for his sins and humbly accepted God's will about whether he would return again to Jerusalem or die in exile. I'm Dan Cathcart from Moed Ministries International. Shalom and be blessed.